Let's get started. Hello again. I'm saying hello again since I messed up last time with my phone being on. This is Everyday Anarchism. I am your host, Graham Culbertson. And my guest today is Rhiannon Firth. Did I say that right or close to right?
Just about, yeah.
And we're here to talk about not a book that you wrote, but a book that you wrote the afterword to called Journey Through Utopia, which somehow I'd never heard of, but I was doing some work trying to compare Plato's Republic and Hobbes's Leviathan. And all of a sudden, whenever I was looking around, I found this. Oh, no, I'm already off topic. That's not how I found this book. It was relevant to me because of that. But I read, I don't know how to say her name either, Amya Srinivasaran's, she had a really amazing piece recently about how psychoanalysis is coming back as a useful tool for political analysis. And kind of the left-wing hero of that piece is this usually considered a joke psychoanalyst named Wilhelm Reich. He's a mid-century psychoanalyst who has weird theories.
Oh, he's brilliant. I love Wilhelm Reich.
What's that?
I love Wilhelm Reich.
Yes, well, I had not read any of his stuff, but she made him sound so compelling and interesting, and he was the inspiration for Bernie. I'll let you talk in a second.
She sounds great. I'll have to look at her work as well.
Yeah.
And I don't know how you pronounce her name or who she is. I'll have to look her up.
I'll send it and I'll put a link into it. It was a piece in the London Review of Books, and I just thought, wow, obviously Wilhelm Reich wasn't a card-carrying anarchist, but I bet the anarchists liked his work, and so I just Googled Wilhelm Reich anarchism. Yeah. And I got this piece by this theorist I'd never heard of before named Louise Berneri, who said that anarchists should be using Wilhelm Reich's work on sex for their analysis. And I thought, who is this Berneri woman? And then I found this book, Journey Through Utopia. And then I found that it's been recently re-released by PM Press, and you wrote an afterword to it. And here we are. So now I'm going to stop talking, and you can tell us who you are and how you came to this book.
Okay, hello, I'm Rhiannon. I'm an academic, and I've been interested in anarchism since before I was an academic. And then I guess I was interested in anarchism through the kind of anti-roads protests and the traveller and rave scene in the late 90s in the United Kingdom, and I was sort of hanging out and doing that, and then tried leading this double life as a good student, and sort of keeping them separate, I suppose. But I got interested through my academic studies in utopias and utopianism, which at the time seemed to be the sort of closest thing I felt like I was allowed to do to anarchism, was to sort of escape to a dream world of utopia in my academic studies at university. But as I sort of progressed through my graduate and postgraduate studies, I realised that I could actually study and write about anarchism if I wanted to. I mean, it's always a battle, and it's often not treated with, perhaps sometimes I feel like I'm not treated as seriously as I could be at some academic conferences or whatever, because people in the academic world don't like the word anarchism, as is the case in all sections of society, I think. But yeah, Journey Through Utopia is one of these books that I suppose has always been there, especially since I was always interested in utopia and anarchism. It itself is not actually an academic book. I mean, she wasn't a sort of very academic person. She was someone who wrote for more of a kind of Labour-interested anarchist audience. And I dipped into the book before to kind of inform some of my academic analyses of things like Plato's Utopia and stuff like that. But I'd never actually read the whole book myself. I'd just sort of dipped into it and knew it existed, and didn't really get into it until I was actually approached to write the afterword. When I was actually working on another project, which was very boring, and I got approached by PM Press to write this afterward, and I was really excited by that because, I just think it's a fantastic book, and I was aware it existed. And I know it's about utopia and anarchism, which is what I'm all about. So I said yes, and then I had to read the whole book, and I really enjoyed it, actually, more than I thought I would. just because it's quite a big book, I suppose, and because I dipped into bits of it and not really read the whole thing, I hadn't really got a full impression of Berneri's voice. But when I read it, I realised that she's got a very calming and very informative voice without being patronising. And she basically goes through the sort of whole canon of, I think, of like utopias, which is what I'd been interested in. But like she explains it with such sort of clarity, I think. And she has her own take on it, which is an anti-authoritarian kind of anarchist take. She writes well, and I just think it's a really fantastic book. So I suppose my aim in the afterword was to do something similar, but about contemporary utopias that had arisen since she'd been writing, since she wrote her book, I suppose. So that's what I tried to do. And actually, I found it a really, really helpful exercise for me in my own writing style, because I tried to kind of adopt her writing style and just basically tell people in a kind of narrative way just about the books I'd read and that I'd enjoyed and what I'd enjoyed about them from a kind of anarchist perspective, which I think is what she did. And I think, like, even after this book, it's just really transformed my writing style and how I understand academic work and writing. So if anything, I think that's one of the best things about the book is her actual style and how sort of clear and gentle it is as a style.
Yeah, and I want to add, this is a very unusual kind of book, or I think it's an unusual kind of book. You don't see books written like this much these days, and I'm not sure that you would see it that much. This is somewhere between a like study of utopias and a like an anthology of utopias, because she provides very long and extensive quotes, but not so much. It's not like there's 3 pages of Berneri and then 30 pages of Plato, like if it were a literary or a philosophical anthology. So she's doing the readings of Plato all along, but also Plato or More or whoever. I feel like she quoted Plato more than anyone else. By the time I got to News from Nowhere, I noticed it was a lot shorter and there was a lot less quotes. But I feel like I'll say this. If a lot of these books that are interesting to you, and I think they should be interesting to you if you're interested in the topics on this podcast, if you haven't read them and you think you're unlikely to sit down and read Thomas More's Utopia or Bellamy's what's the Bellamy, Looking Backward, this book will let you read several well-chosen pages and passages from those, as well as this, exactly as you say, this lovely and completely anarchist reading of all of these texts. It reminds me of like a college course, like if you had a really good professor who assigned you these readings and then lectured on them, I could imagine that being turned into this book. I don't know if that resonates with you as a description of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like a compendium or a reader or something, isn't it? But from a kind of anarchist viewpoint, which, like, I wish that there was a book like that for every topic, really.
Yes, you're right. We need them. We need all sorts of them. And I do think you're right that it's such a pleasant and calming read. I actually want to jump back to how you said that you were studying utopia as an academic, and afraid that you weren't supposed to be studying anarchism, and utopia was as close as you can get, because I traditionally take the line that anarchism should be against utopia. Insofar as, I agree with Berneri that the general utopian strategy, it goes something like this. Step 1, figure out what the perfect world is. Step 2, explain how if I were in charge, the world would be that perfect world. Step 3, come up with a strategy where no one is ever allowed to disagree with me. I know this is a little overly simplistic, but I feel like that's the general utopian impulse. And I want to take a sort of what's the subtitle of one of James C. Scott's books is how certain schemes to improve the human condition have failed. I want to take this anarchist approach to Plato and say, no. Step one is tear off the authoritarian structures, and step two is we do whatever we want, and that's utopia. So, with the exception of William Morris and Ursula Le Guin and a few others, it strikes me that utopianism, at least as Berneri reads it, is anti-anarchism and vice versa.
Okay, so I mein, I'd take issue with that for a few reasons. First of all, I think, like you said, there are lots of anarchist utopias. So, Ursula Le Guin writes anarchist utopias. There's a lot of kind of anarchist-ish utopias from the feminist movement of the 70s, which are certainly anti-authoritarian, at least, if not anarchist, coming from the same kind of movement as Le Guin was coming from. And like my PhD supervisor was Lucy Sargison, who wrote a book called Contemporary Feminist Utopianism, which was published in around 1996, I think. So, it's not so contemporary anymore. And it was sort of looking back to the 70s and 80s, and makes me feel quite old, actually. But Lucy's work's absolutely fantastic. And her and Tom Moylan, who's written a book about critical utopias, and Lucy Sargison writes about transgressive utopias and feminist utopias. They talk about, they're both coming from a very anti-authoritarian standpoint that's kind of sympathetic to post-structuralism and or anarchism, especially in Tom Moylan's case. And they write about there being sort of two conflicting types of utopias. There's blueprint utopias, which are the kind of utopias that you explain, which kind of set out a blueprint, and it's a very detailed description of society, and it's like, right, this is how society should be. And then there's critical utopias, which use utopianism as a kind of methodological tool for critiquing society in a way, by showing that things can be done differently. So when that kind of different society is shown, it isn't shown as a kind of, this is how things must be in that authoritarian sense. It's sort of shown as, here's an extrapolation of a different society, and it holds a mirror to the present. And that can be done as a dystopia. So if you think about things like Zamyatin's We, or, I suppose George Orwell's 1984, there's plenty of dystopias out there, but they often kind of extrapolate authoritarian trends from the present and then present it as this kind of magnified version of, a terrible world that makes everyone become more afraid of the bad elements, within their current society. And it sort of teaches people to be critical, and it does that through mobilizing emotions and affect such as fear. And like utopia can do the same. So it doesn't necessarily have to be like, oh, we have to go to this place. So, like Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed is like an ambiguous utopia is the subtitle. So she shows a lot of the problems within an anarchist society. Decisions take ages. There can be a kind of diffuse social moralism that takes over from authoritarian statism. And she doesn't present it as a kind of perfect society, but she does present elements which seem better than our society, and which can kind of mobilize us to think, oh, that would be good if we had more equal gender relations, or, if we had more choice in the work that we did, or so on. So it kind of mobilizes emotions of hope by making us think of like very different ways things could be. It's kind of like a laboratory for checking out, critique and political emotions and things like that. But another thing I'd say about utopia is that they don't have to be works of literature, or they don't have to be works of political or social theory. They can also be like lived experiments. So intentional communities, for example, have sometimes been understood and studied as utopias, even though the people living in them don't think they're living in utopia. They are a kind of utopian phenomenon which tries to experiment with social change by just illustrating how things could be different, rather than trying to do it through a revolution, I guess.
Yeah. Oh, there's so many things I want to ask there. This will probably provide us enough material for like the rest of our talk. Let me just start with like a historical question. It strikes me that the vast majority of the utopias that Berneri writes about are blueprint utopias. It also seems that as the genre of utopia has been recognized historically, what what you're now calling blueprint utopias seems to me to be fairly synonymous with utopian thinking up until the 20th century. So I guess my question is, has there been a shift in how people wrote utopias over the past 100 or 150 years? Or is it simply that we weren't calling these other forms of these critical utopias necessarily, and that's why they don't end up in this utopian history?
Okay, I mean, I suppose there's a few things going on. I mean, history sort of tends to be written by the victor or whatever. So there's probably been all sorts of interesting little experiments that haven't survived or been written about, that were trying to change society. I mean, Pythagoras had an intentional community, actually. I don't know if you know about that, but, Pythagoras, the triangle guy, had his own intentional community. And I mean, that could be understood as a utopia in a sense. It was based on sort of vegetarianism and equality of genders and so on. So, and there's been all sorts of things, but like utopia is an idea that, the word came from Thomas More in Thomas More's Utopia in 1516 or whenever he wrote that. But then it's kind of read back as an epistemological concept for understanding things like Plato's Republic. But Plato didn't call his Republic
Mm-hmm.
a utopia. But it's often used to understand social programs. But I think it's like just a sort of epistemological lens you can apply to almost anything. So that's how Ernst Bloch used it, who's sort of one of the Frankfurt School precursors to the Frankfurt School political theory. He wrote this kind of 3-volume magnus opus on the principle of hope, and he reads utopia into all sorts of things like medicine and fairy tales and just like every culture. I mean, it's basically a work of cultural studies, but it's using the term utopia as a concept to understand almost every cultural product as having a kind of germ of hope within it. So it's kind of looking at the society, the desired society within these kind of, within anything really, any cultural practice or product. So you can read utopia into almost anything. And I think there obviously was a big anti-authoritarian social and political movement during the 1970s. And as part of that, there was an explicit movement for writing utopian literature. So that can be seen as a big wave of utopianism that came out of that kind of historical movement, I suppose. But, there's probably been lots of anti-authoritarian social movements and moments in history. So the Diggers and Dreamers or whatever could be read as the Diggers could be read as utopian, if you see what I mean. And the intentional Diggers and Dreamers is like the intentional communities website, which is like a directory that you can look for intentional communities worldwide now. But they're sort of basing part of their vision in the Diggers, who could be read as utopian. Or there's all sorts of anti-authoritarian or any anarchist movement. I suppose you could say, what is the desired society here? What were they trying to put into place? And then utopia is just a kind of methodological tool or like a theoretical concept that can help you understand the sort of underlying desires and hope and future vision behind any social movement, I guess. Or
Yeah.
especially prefigurative experiments as well.
Yeah, that all makes sense. A couple of notes I want to make for the listeners is one. I mean, I did know about Pythagoras because I had a scholar named Kristen Godsey on to talk about her book Everyday Utopia. This was a couple of years back, and she, it was a real challenge for me and a fascinating book because I am so textual. I am such an intellectual historian. I read things that people wrote, usually, not reading in the archive, and finding, the lived experiences that people had is just something that I am not well equipped to do. And something that Kristen wrote in her introduction was sort of like, when people study utopias, they traditionally go to these texts, these big famous texts of philosophy or speculative fiction. And she wanted to look at both ancient and contemporary intentional communities where people were actually living, rather than writing these experiences. And I think, as you say, there's just a bias in the sources. We know a lot more about what Thomas More wrote than what about some group of peasants in the 13th century might have thought about their communal farm. We just don't have.
Yeah,
For me,
exactly.
yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly the point I was sort of making, I think. Yeah.
And there's people doing the work of trying to access that other stuff. I mean, Win Stanley's a great one. Like Win Stanley is absolutely utopian, I would say. I guess. Well, I guess I just want to check and see if there's anything else you want to say in response to that before I go on.
Not really. I mean, just that I completely agree. And I suppose that what's interesting about you, one of the things that's interesting about utopias is the everydayness of them. So even though they are supposed to be these, or, they're often understood to be these huge social programs, people like Thomas More, who wrote Utopia, but, many utopian writers, not so much Plato, but, many utopian writers write about what is the everyday life in this place like. They're kind of quite holistic descriptions of society. So whilst, Marx in Capital or whatever does not, tell us what you'd eat for dinner in a communist society, he does have his thing about, you could be a philosopher and a fisherman or, whatever it is. But that's the only kind of germ of utopia people are often able to find in Marxism, and then also kind of just extrapolations about what might a more equal society be like. But what sort of utopian fiction writers and also sort of people who do these like utopia as a form of social theory, it's very much looking at the everyday and like, what do people eat for dinner? Who prepares dinner? Where are the toilets? Who deals with the sewage? Like, how are decisions made on a daily basis? Who does particular types of work and so on. So, the utopian socialists were very concerned with that in their descriptions for society, but also in trying to put these things into place. And yeah, I think that everydayness of utopia is part of what's exciting about it, but also part of what doesn't make the history books as much.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. And that's Christian Godsey really wanted to try and get, I mean, hence the title Everyday Utopia, which of course also just delightful to have a book called Everyday Utopia on a podcast called Everyday Anarchism. I mean, at least that made me happy. I guess the next thing to move to is, let's talk about dystopia. This gets into, I mean, I've got the book here. So there's a foreword, an introduction, a postscript, and an afterword. So there's two things at the beginning and two at the end. And in the postscript, which is by Kim Stanley Robinson, which I believe comes after your afterword, he starts off by talking about, dystopias and negative utopias and satire. And I don't know if he uses the phrase critical utopia, but that really seems to be what he's getting at there. And anyone, I mean, maybe this has died down a bit, but 10 or 15 years ago, there was this, well, no, Squid Game. I forgot about Squid Game. There's been these incredibly striking and violent images. They started off sort of for children or young adults, like Hunger Games or Maze Runner, and now we have Squid Game, of these people who have taken the capitalist system of competition and suffering that the underclass is experiencing, while the actual capitalists luxuriate in wealth and luxury, and turned it into these truly blood curdling visions. I mean, the Hunger Games is literally about children murdering each other for the delight of plutocrats, and it's very popular. And apparently, she's still writing the books, and it's still going. my first instinct wouldn't be to call this a utopia, but when we're going with satire, the idea is this is the world you are living in. You're living in a world in which children are murdering one another for the benefit of plutocrats. You maybe haven't quite noticed that's what's happening. So let's take our current society and go 100 years in the future, and what you get is the Hunger Games. And when we think of that as a strand of utopian thinking, then, so much of popular culture and especially science fiction becomes utopian or dystopian in that way.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I mean, I've always argued people think of dystopia as like the opposite to utopia, but I argue it's a subgenre of utopia. And like, I mean, I was sort of already saying that, but it has a political function that's also a pedagogical function, which is mobilizing our imagination and our emotions and our affect in the service of, I suppose, critique and desire. So, critique of the status quo and desire for something different. So I think that's why there's such an interest of like utopia in the disciplines of education, which is I'm in an education department now, and cultural studies, because it's a kind of means of social change through education and cultural studies by kind of mobilizing people's, waking people up in a way, saying, look, this is what the world's like. This is, isn't this terrifying? Aren't you terrified? You should be. And, or, don't you want something different? Look how wonderful things could be. It's sort of a kind of device for shaking people up a bit, I suppose.
Yes, it is. It is. And I love it. And I was thinking, as you were talking, so I wrote my dissertation on, among other things, realist and naturalist novels in the 19th and early 20th century. And the
That's
biggest...
crazy. I wrote my undergraduate dissertation on something very similar.
Oh wow! What did you write it on?
It was like 19th century realist novels in Russia and France or something.
Okay, amazing. So let's talk about Émile Zola then.
Yeah, it was about Zola and Balzac.
Because you mentioned the utopias are like a laboratory, and Zola claimed his fiction was like a laboratory. And listeners, if you haven't read any Zola, he's less read these days.
I read L'Assommoir. I loved L'Assommoir.
Yes, and his books are. I've read 3 or 4. L'Assommoir was one of them. I haven't read them though since I was writing my dissertation 20 years ago.
Which other ones can you recommend? Because I'd like to read more Zola now. I'm thinking of it.
I can't come up with any right now. I'm so embarrassed. Okay. I probably have some. So the listeners can't see this. I'm looking up at my shelves, and there must be
shelf as well. I know that I've got another one somewhere. I can just see L'Assommoir up there, but I can't see that. I bought another one at some point, but I didn't start it anyway.
Well, they're up there somewhere for me. Well, so and then there's Americans who take this. Frank Norris famously is one. Well, but sticking with Zola. So Zola is, he's mostly known these days for opposing anti-Semitism with the Dreyfus affair, but he's a real, left figure. And when you read his books, that's not apparent, because his books are really just about poor people. Well, they're not only about this, but his most famous books are about poor people experiencing what the philosopher Gilles Deleuze, sorry, I can't pronounce Deleuze, but experiencing what Deleuze calls the slope of naturalism, meaning you start off sort of at the bottom rungs of society, and if you're reading a Zola novel, this character who started off at the bottom rungs of society is not going to end up a plutocrat, but is going to end up somehow even lower than they started.
Yeah.
And I just thought these Zola books were miserable. And then I read the literature on them, and people were like, can't you see all of the hope in Zola? And I couldn't see it. But you're supposed to read this book where someone breaks his leg, and once he breaks his leg, the only thing that can happen to him from there on in is misery and suffering and death and violence. And what you were supposed to think is, well, workers should have some protections and
The
and
woman, the
healthcare.
woman dies in a cupboard or something, doesn't she?
Yes, yes. And it seems nothing but horror. But the people who read it at the time, they read these books, and Zola, he doesn't break the plane and leave you with an exhortation to go out and storm the barricades or fight the bourgeoisie. It's all totally contained. But you're supposed to read these texts and say, "Oh no, this work that Zola wrote is completely accurate to society." And also, I can see the various parts of society that cause this enormous suffering. And now I need to join a social movement to oppose those parts of society. Dreiser, I can't believe I forgot his name. Theodore Dreiser is another, socialist American naturalist who, reading his novels, it's not obvious to me that he is a socialist. It just seems like his books are about poor people who suffer. But, Dreiser was friends with Jack London and was a socialist activist. He wanted you to see.
Tolstoy's an anarchist, isn't he? And
Yes.
War and Peace is you can't really see it in there. It's just about the bourgeoisie having nice parties and stuff. And
yeah, it's you have to look beyond what's obvious, I think, and when you find them as dystopian stories, suddenly this terrible fiction of misery and suffering takes a totally different sense or tone.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it's not utopian though, is it? Because it's not illustrating the different thing, but it is mobilizing affect, I suppose. It's mobilizing an unhappiness with the state of the world. Or I suppose Tolstoy does have his utopian moments because he has the kind of war, which is all very dystopian, but also has its kind of he does explore the feelings of glorification and things like that within it as well, I suppose. But, and also the darker sides of the kind of peaceful moments. But yeah, it is about mobilizing affect, but I wouldn't say, and it's interesting because I'd never thought of bringing these things together, actually. I kind of just thought I looked at realism in my undergrad, and I've never been a literary scholar. I'm more interested in theory and so on, but I've never thought of bringing together my interest in utopia with my sort of previous interest in realism, but it does seem an interesting link because they do kind of mobilize political affect and, the desire to go and join a social movement, I guess.
Yeah. Well, you might. Jack London has some. Jack London is a socialist and a realist or naturalist novelist, and writes. I don't know if he writes any positive utopias, but writes some dystopian things. The Iron Heel is often cited as a proto-fascist narrative. So Jack London is the first obvious place where you can find someone who is writing Zola-style narratives and H.G. Wells-style science fiction. So I would start there if you're interested. I mean, H.G. Wells does show up in this book. I want to turn now, though, if we can, to this other another negative sense of utopia, which is not the kind of totalitarian blueprint thing, but the idea. I mean, David Graeber uses it this way in his idea of utopia of rules, but the idea that there's also utopian thinking among policy makers, and bosses. There's a real utopian view among bosses that if someone, it says on their contract that they are supposed to work for 8 hours a day, that person should be actively working for 8 hours a day. And if they're in a factory, that means they get 2 5-minute breaks, but they actually have to clock out 8 hours and 11 minutes after they got there because we want those 5 minutes accounted for. And then, of course, if they're a keyboard worker, the bosses want to install software to make sure that their keyboard is working for 8 hours a day. And I think Graeber would say, this is totally utopian thinking. If you're a boss, you just got to accept that if someone is in the office for 8 hours a day, they're going to do 3 hours of actual work. And that's about all that most human beings can actually produce in a day. And you're going for something platonic in a bad way. In the same way that you think if we just have enough police, we'll have no more crime. This is utopian thinking in the bad sense. So I wanted to see what you thought about that sense of like utopian to mean when people devise the systems of law and order and control, they are always astonished when those systems don't fit the blueprint in their head.
Yeah, I mean, I think that goes back to what I was saying earlier about how utopia, rather than being a sort of very specific genre, it's actually just a kind of epistemological tool or a theoretical concept that helps us ask certain questions about social practices or about social organization or, any aspects really of culture and society. It helps us ask, like, what are the desires underlying this? What is the what does this prefigure? What is the vision within this practice or this, organization or this set of rules? What kind of, can we extrapolate from that the desires behind it, the vision behind it? What would this be like if it was magnified? And whose desires are those? And, what would a world that they created in their interests look like? And, this is a prefiguration of that or something like that. And I think that those are the really interesting questions that Utopia helps us to ask, that I don't know of any other concepts that kind of helps us with those questions, I suppose.
Yeah, and this, I mentioned that maybe we should talk about AI, and I don't really want to, but it does seem that like what Elon Musk is absolutely a utopian, and Sam Altman is in a certain way. I think Musk said he was going to solve crime by creating a robot that would follow everyone who had been identified as a potential criminal and just stop them from doing crime. And this is in this epistemological way you're talking about. This is such a utopian statement. It tells you exactly what Musk thinks crime is and what sort of society Musk wants to live in. And he wants to live in a society in which techno-utopians can exert infinite force via mechanical minions against any humans they have deemed bad.
Yeah. I mean, my last book that I wrote, which I could maybe plug on the podcast, is called Utopia in the Factory, Prefigurative Knowledge Against Cybernetics. And it's looking at how, two different types of utopia can exist within a factory. There's the technocratic utopia of the machines and everything that's been designed in the interest of capitalism. And then there's the utopia of the kind of small scale everyday resistances and everyday creativity and hobbying that the workers do, that's kind of between the cracks in the machines, that transgresses what the machines were made for, playing with the machines, or even doing things in the interest of capital, but doing it in a way that is not the way they're supposed to with the machines and things, like plugging the gaps in the capitalist utopia, either by resisting or even just holding things together in ways that, the machines themselves don't prefigure or allow, I suppose. And the book itself is a critique of more than Musk's utopias and so on, which obviously I'm very critical of, but also of the kind of technocratic strains within anarchism and on the left, which think that you can fix human problems and social problems through organization. So I think there is a dangerous kind of tendency within some strains of anarchism to think like, we just need the right technology or we just need the right form of organization and then, everyone's going to behave. But who decides what that is, So there's a lot about anarchist cybernetics now, which is, about particular types of organization, and it might, ideas around how we can get rid of sort of human hierarchies within anarchist organizations. But a lot of these, first of all, they're just completely going full circle back to like what you were talking about at the start of the podcast about Wilhelm Reich and sort of ideas around unconscious desires amongst humans and so on. You can't systematize these into the perfect organization. I think they have to be acknowledged or played out, or there has to be a role for these kind of things which don't serve anyone's interests always, and they can't be fixed into a perfect anarchist non-hierarchical organization, but they can be acknowledged and we can find ways to work with them and overcome them. But not necessarily technocratic ways, I suppose. So yeah, I like to see anarchism as a sort of ethical and political project, and as I guess even a psychoanalytic project, but not a technical project.
Yes, I could not agree more with that. I was thinking when you were talking about factories, you haven't by any chance seen the Rainer Werner Fassbinder TV show 8 Hours Don't Make a Day, have you? No, so I want to make an episode about this someday, but it seems that no one has seen it. But it's about factory workers, but it's about the lives of the factory workers both in and outside of the factory. But the drama in the second half of the show, it's a miniseries, is that one of the factory workers has, maybe not against orders, but on his own uh, recognizance, improved the machinery so that it works more efficiently. And the boss, of course, loves this, and it's like, this is great. You're going to make us so much more money, and we'll give you some of it. And this causes a crisis because the workers can't figure out why they don't get all of it, because it was their work and they were fiddling around. And that's how they learn how capitalism works. And of course, I mean, it's a Fassbinder film, so it's also is just fun and wild. Someday I'll do an episode on it. We should head towards the end. I realize we didn't talk about the Oscar Wilde quote about like a temporary utopia that you're aiming for, and then once you reach it, you just move on from there. I suppose that's a potential another way out of the blueprint utopia problem. So we can speak about that briefly, or we can just let the listeners Google Oscar Wilde utopia. I think that would be fine. I'm sure I had Declan. I don't know how to pronounce his last name. Declan O'Donegal, something like that, on the podcast to talk about Oscar Wilde. So I'm sure we talked about utopia then. So really all that's left for me to say is, what else would you like to talk about that we haven't covered in the next couple of minutes, Oscar Wilde or otherwise, and then we can go from there.
Okay, maybe not Oscar Wilde because I don't know a huge amount about him. What would I like to talk about? I mean, I suppose another book I'm interested in, another book I wrote, sorry, that I'd like to plug is my book, Disaster Anarchy. And I talk about how in disaster and crisis situations, people often come together in mutual aid and stuff like we saw during COVID and whatever. But like thinking of that as a kind of utopia, just how when the actual system of capitalism breaks down, and out of necessity, I suppose can we think of that as a utopia? Because obviously it's horrific situations, and there's a kind of capitalist discourse that has cast those things as utopias as well, but which tries to you mobilize that kind of human mutual aid and so on, and desire to help one another in the interest of capital. So as social capital, just so that the welfare state, to stop the welfare state from having to set in. But I'm interested in how people kind of try to defend their non-hierarchical or anarchist utopias against those kind of encroachments which try to sort of sanitize them, I suppose. And there's sort of ideas around like the Disneyfication of utopia and, making it all nice and sentimental, but ultimately being in the interest of capital. And I'm sort of quite interested in how we can keep utopia angry and radical and, anti-capitalist and anti-state and so on. Because there is a very utopian aspect to capitalism of just, finding a way to make everyone's desires sellable, I guess.
Yeah.
How do we sell this back to the people that made it? So I'm interested in how we decommodify utopia, or how we kind of keep it non-commodified.
Yeah, I think I'm pretty clearly on record as finding Hayek's vision of capitalism, in which just like everyone always gets exactly what they want because everything has been determined perfectly by this distributed computer of human desires. That's quite amenable. Like if someone would let me push a button tomorrow, and like actually that vision that emerges in the road to serfdom of like it's a very utopian vision in that sense. But it turns out the actual holders of capital don't want this world in which, it's also very anti-capital. This version of cap. I mean, this is the old joke. Cory Doctorow is always saying capitalists hate capitalism. If capitalism means if you have money, you get more money, then capitalists love capitalism. But if capitalism means everyone who has money is always scrambling to meet the desires of their fellow humans, then like, oh, that's okay. Like, I wouldn't mind a world in which everyone who had money was always scrambling to meet my desires. That's kind of what Hayek describes. I don't think that's it's hard to find an actual capitalist who actually wants to live in that world. They find it much too stressful, and their mansions might get foreclosed. And they like the world in which other people's houses are foreclosed upon. So I actually think capitalism is I mean, first of all, it's certainly a utopian project in terms of monetizing everyone's desires, but it's also just a utopian as it's defended by Hayek and Smith. It's a utopian vision in the sense of, oh, this is a world that sounds great on paper, but I'd be very interested to see you actually achieve this vision that you are supposedly for. And it looks like you're actually working. Most capitalists, I think, are working for the exact opposite world than the one. Like, I think you could square Hayek and William Morris if you really wanted to. The earlier Hayek, but the people Hayek was hanging out with were authoritarian oligarchs. I don't know. I've gone off Hayek again. All right, so just I think we're good. So anything else you would like to say before we go?
No, I don't think so. Just thanks very much for having me. It's been a really enjoyable chat.
Good, wonderful. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.